Students, I wanted to give you some video feedback about the forum on CNA caregiving, the article by Di Pasquale et al. Everybody did a great job of taking the readings for this week, especially on sampling, and trying to apply it to this article. Great discussion and a lot of difference of opinion, some agreement about a few things. So I wanted to see if I could clarify some of the similarities, differences, and also some of the questions that you posed for me. First of all, everybody rightly, I think, identified that the authors did a great job of providing a theoretical framework for their research questions. I think only one student disagreed. I wanted to address, first of all, the issue about the sample. This is a really interesting article, which is why I use it, because I think the authors are not as clear as they could be about their actual sampling approach, how you would describe it. So indeed, they actually start out with the sampling unit at the facility level. They go through a process of trying to identify what I would call friendly facilities, facilities that are willing to participate in the research from all of those that they asked if they would be a part. You're seeing my dog walk around in the back. He can help us with sampling. Then, from those that were willing, they again talked with the facility supervisors, the owners of this particular partner company that they decided to use. And then, as many of you noted, they worked with him to identify facilities based on certain attributes to do the research. And I would say at that level, they actually have identified only those facilities that the owner or his or her representative, felt would probably be a place to do the research successfully. That's not uncommon, but as many of you mentioned, it's certainly not a random sample, and it could lend some bias because you're certainly not getting CNAs that are in different kinds of facilities, non-isolated, have lower turnover, etc. So it's a cherry-picked sample of facilities to participate. In an exploratory study, that is probably acceptable because the authors, the researchers, are just making an attempt, perhaps without a lot of funding, to try to conduct the research and get the best possible findings, even with this limited sample. So they start with a sampling unit, actually, of facilities. It's a little misleading because they describe their sample as participants, but they only do that. They stratify at the facility level first. Then they take a sample of participants from all of those facilities, again, a second level of stratification, but then they only use those participants from those facilities that are already participating in the larger WHFS study itself, further limiting who those CNAs represent. So it's a multi-stage sampling approach, and I think they could do a little bit better in describing it so that it's easier for you to determine what it is. But clearly, it's a non-probability sample. It is not a random sample. It's in some ways a convenience sample at the first level of stratification, where the facilities who are the company who's willing to participate is a choice, and then that company further selects facilities based on certain characteristics where it's likely that the research can be carried out successfully. Then they choose participants, and then they choose participants that are only those in a larger study. So it definitely adds bias to the sampling process. So great job trying to grapple with that. It's not fully clear or well described in the article itself. I mean, the steps are well described, but they don't put it in a framework of a sampling plan with a label on it. So good job to all of you for trying to talk about that. The other issue was that many people were concerned about the night shift being excluded. I agree that that does bias the sample in some way. I think, however, again, for an exploratory study, these authors were looking for a population of CNAs that were most alike. And in fact, as you say, the night shift CNAs would probably be quite different. Not necessarily only for the reasons that the authors note, that they have less encounter with the patients, but because, in fact, they may have unique health issues because of that. That, in fact, including that night shift, given that reality, could have caused real bias in the study, or at least complicated their findings, especially if they didn't have a large enough sample of night shift nurses compared to day and evening. And given those numbers, that might have been challenging to do. So they would have had to look at how do they control for differences in the shifts, knowing that the populations may be quite different themselves based on health characteristics and other things like that. So you raise the issue importantly, but it may be that they excluded it for reasons that make perfect sense from a research perspective and certainly from a statistical analysis perspective. Having a much larger random sample and having large enough numbers of night shift workers included in a study where you could control for the differences in their health behaviors, health characteristics, and other variables could certainly be a next step follow-up study. And again, many of you talked about that needing further exploration. So good, great discussion around that. It's an important issue. The authors themselves do acknowledge that the geographic limitation is certainly a limit on generalizability to their study. Again, it's an exploratory study. It's a first step. So some of these things we can excuse, especially because the authors acknowledge them. The other question that someone raised is like, what the heck is a binomial regression? Without giving you a really in-depth statistical lesson, which I think would be hard to understand without a bigger statistical education, I want to try to give you an idea of what they're doing when they say they do that to their data. So typically, when there are variables that are counts, we typically have variables where we're looking, statistical analysis looks at things and relies on things like knowing the mean and the variance of a variable. And where we have counts, there's often a difference between what are called observed and estimated variances. And we call that a lack of fit. Again, you don't have to understand that fully. But what a binomial regression, what they're doing by that is they're taking these variables that are counts versus, let's say, a scale or a score, and they're trying to adjust the fit of those variables so that they don't negatively impact the later statistical analysis that uses those variables. So we're adjusting that lack of fit between the variance, the mean and the variance in these variables, so that when they do something else, the later statistical analysis, the ANOVA, and the other things that they are doing are using variables that have had this adjustment. I know that's probably less complicated, hopefully less complicated than my trying to really go through the mathematics of exactly what happens in a binomial regression. It's very complicated, but that's what we're trying to do, is take variables where a scale, a variable with a score, it's the mean and the variance are typically very, the fit is very reliable between the observed variances and the estimated variances. But in a count, a variable that's based on a count rather than having a mean score, we have to try to sort of create that and adjust that fit using this binomial regression. Anyway, probably more than you want to know. And again, you don't have to understand it only to know that it is a good indication of quality that they've taken the care to describe how they're adjusting and treating these variables that are counts versus other types of variables to ensure that they can be used reliably in further statistical analysis in the study. Great questions, really great discussion all around. I can see all of you are really delving into this and trying to get a grasp, and great work on trying to apply the readings on sampling, especially to this research article. We'll have more opportunities to continue to do this as we read articles throughout the term. We'll be looking more at things that are quantitative or qualitative studies, but you'll always be coming back to things like, did the authors establish a solid theoretical basis? Do they adequately describe their sampling plan? Do they talk about study limitations? Does the statistical analysis make sense? And to the extent possible, you've started that process with this assignment. So I appreciate all of your hard work. If you have any further questions, please let me know. I'd be happy to discuss it more with you. Take care and look forward to continuing this discussion with you as we look at other research types.